Welcome to New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world. This is episode 5, La guerre de Conquête, the fall of Nouvelle France. What if I told you the 1759 fall of Quebec wasn't the end of New France? In fact, the very next year the entire manpower complement and all the available artillery left in New France proper would be brought right back to the plains of Abraham. There was even a new commander to replace the fallen Marquis de Montcalm. The Chevalier de Lévis was promoted by Governor-General Vaudreuil to lead the counterattack from Montreal. A veteran of the French-European conflicts and awarded the prestigious Croix de Saint-Louis, Lévis was second in command at all the crucial past French victories of the current war. He alone possessed the knowledge and connections that could rally both the French and their native allies for one last push against the British. Meanwhile, the powerful British fleet that had subdued Quebec had left General Murray and his garrison of 6,000 to hold the position over the winter of 1759 to 1760. Though the British surrounded the French position from multiple geographic access points, winter in Canada proved to be just as trying of an enemy as the French. The garrison started to freeze and die from scurvy by the end of December 1759, as the ice sealed off any water access for supply to the fortress. French naval reinforcements would not be forthcoming, having been smashed off the shores of southwest France and West Africa, nor did the French government prioritize the mission, given the likelihood of failure. French forces could still count upon the Catholic Mohawk of Kanawake and their half-African, half-Abenaki chief Louis Cook. Cook had fought in the earliest engagements of the war, and will again be present in our narrative going forward with the American Revolution, but at this time he still led a strong contingent of several hundred native warriors. The French retooled their army and separated out the Canadian militia. Historian Dr. Peter Macleod writes that this militia broke ranks with the French regulars on the plains of Abraham, but served with exceptional bravery when employed as skirmishers on the British flanks, covering the retreat of the French regulars alongside native allies. Spring of 1760 saw a renewed French force of almost 4,000 regulars and 2,700 Canadian militia. This included Acadian refugees. The French even managed to contact merchants who stockpiled supplies to sell to the British at Quebec for high prices, paying bribes to move these goods downriver to Montreal. The French hadn't the horses to attempt a winter campaign, but Murray had lost half his effectives to disease over the winter. Now it was a race once again on the water routes of New York and Quebec. The British wanted to avoid a repeat of the previous year and sought to meet the incoming French force south of Quebec City, at the end of the cliff line that ran to the Cap Rouge River. Though Murray had the elevation advantage, word of French ships down the St. Lawrence and intelligence that the French force before them was just a diversion, with the real force swinging east to emplace themselves between the British and Quebec. Murray ordered a retreat to the edge of the plains of Abraham. Here a rearguard action allowed his forces to safely enter the city. The French pulled back and began to organize their forces on the periphery of the plains, while on the morning of April 28, 1760, a depleted British force was determined to keep their French counterparts from advancing too close to the walls of the fortress city. Instead, they would scale the same small stone ridge that had initially given Montcalm's forces their advantage, but instead they charged down from their position and into history. Murray was not going to make the same mistake here, so he headed out extra early to begin fortifying the ridge. It was from this vantage point he could glimpse the French attempting to organize themselves on the field and spotted an opportunity to attack them. Murray launched into a maneuver that swept up the French left by seizing the stone mill and storehouses being used to anchor their line, while Rangers drove the French from some redoubts constructed the year prior on the right. Now came the crucial moment, and it's why we say history never repeats itself, but it sure does rhyme. General Murray stood atop the same dominant geographical feature as seen by Montcalm's watchful eye. Here he would anchor his artillery to support his depleted troops, and hope his charge off the heights would not end in chaotic failure, as they did the year prior for the French. This day the regular French forces only had a fraction of their manpower organized on the field and were being smashed by the greater artillery train of the British, so Murray's advance off the heights seemed destined to send them into a headlong retreat. Canadian militia and allied native forces had taken up a strong position in the center of the French lines, but set back in a wooded area called Sillery. It was here that they stopped the advance of the British and gave the French time to regroup. At the point of a bayonet, French forces regained control of the mill and their left flank. With the north or left flank secured, British forces were pushed out of the remaining redoubts on the terminus of the French right. It was then that Lévis ordered his reserves hidden in the Sillery woods to skirt the hills, and redoubts at the southern end of the line, and attack the British still attempting to seize back the mill compound in the north. He was surprised to see several hundred Canadian militia and native allies join what would go down as one of the greatest charges in Canadian military history. Sweeping down into the center of British lines, Levis had caused them to angle and faced his assault to cut off the northern sector of the British lines in the process. Had his orders not been garbled and lost when a messenger was killed, he would have had an additional brigade brought onto the field, and this would have probably resulted in a total collapse of the British lines. Ironically, Highlanders made a stand at the central redoubt that stood upon the terrain and named after the fallen British hero of the previous year's battle, but this could not save the British that day. Murray's army retreated back to the safety of Quebec's walls. Casualties were similar for both sides, with 270 French dead and injured, along with 300 British killed and almost 900 wounded or taken captive. The fates of the two armies had suddenly been reversed in a single day. It seemed as if the French had redeemed themselves, and the great battle just a year before would become just another forgotten page in history. Let's reverse time a bit and examine both the combatants and circumstances that led us to this incredible what-if moment, for the battle for Quebec will indeed change the world and end the lives of two talented generals. The future Marquis de Montcalm, Louis Joseph, was brought into this world under the terms of peace. His birth date of February 28, 1712 soon coincided with the 1713 treaty that would cede Acadia to the British. Ironic, given this simmering borderland would help ignite the wars that would rage across Europe and eventually draw the Marquis across the ocean to his fate. Louis Joseph was born next to an imposing chateau in Candiac, a village close to Nimes in southern France. The Montcalm line had served the French crown for over 300 years, but had seen their male line recently convert to Catholicism in the generation before Louis Joseph's birth. The fortress of his birth resembled a miniature Bastille, built with the stones from the fallen Protestant citadel of Nimes and equipped with lovely windows and draped with tapestries. He would later inherit this property upon marrying his wife, Angélique Louise Talon du Boulay, in 1736. Francis Parkman recounts his classical upbringing, as does Christian Ain Crouch. Spurned on in early age by a prodigal brother who ended up dying young, Montcalm excelled in reading, though his tutor Louis Dumas, an out-of-wedlock half-brother of Louis Joseph's father, did note a struggle to develop proper handwriting skills. He was enrolled at the age of 12 in the Hainaut regiment led by his own father, who later purchased him a captaincy. He saw his first action in the siege of Philipsburg in Germany during the War of Polish Succession in 1734, closely examining the way proper siege lines were deployed to make the city surrender. After the marriage to his wife, he had 5 years of peace on his southern French estate, but was called to war again in 1741. The War of Austrian Succession saw him surrounded in Prague and injured by a bomb a year later. He gained valuable experience chasing down northern Italian guerrilla groups in the Piedmont region. It was here where he saw how advantageous undulating mountainous terrain can be when paired with cleverly hidden defensive structures. I speak about Montcalm's experience at the Battle of Assieta in Episode 3, The Arm of God. He would be shot, slashed, blasted, and taken prisoner all in the service of the French king, but he was a brigadier by the end of the conflict in 1748. The Marquis had assumed his title 14 years ago upon his father's death, and now he hoped to enjoy the bounty of his lands, which produced olives, almonds, and lavender. These bountiful lands also served as the background for his ever-growing family of 10 children, so the Marquis decided to found his own regiment and stay near his beloved family. While Louis Joseph was enjoying the life of a country nobleman in the summer of 1755, events halfway around the world would jolt him from his idyllic homestead. By now the French had been engaged with the British over a land dispute in the Ohio River Valley for over a year. The rapidly expanded conflict opened up a unique opportunity for Montcalm. The commander in charge of French North American forces, Baron Dieskau, had been wounded and captured at the Battle of Lake George. The King of France summoned Montcalm to Paris and gave him an offer to rise to the rank of Major General in command of all French forces in North America. Having accepted this great honor, Montcalm made the sea journey in early spring of 1756, trying cod and witnessing an iceberg for the first time. He made it to Quebec City on May 13th. What shaped Montcalm's views of New France and its internal politics? Well, it was most likely the works of Pierre Charlevoix, a well-traveled priest who visited the French Atlantic in the decade after Montcalm was born. Though his views are shaped after the Great Peace of 1701 and Iroquois neutrality, Montcalm would have been fed a diet of unrivaled natural beauty and institutional decline. Charlevoix was concerned with the impact of French Catholicism and it spread amongst the natives. This encouraged a pessimistic view of native relations. Settlers were portrayed as dysfunctional, so much as the role within the Catholic expansion of New France was concerned. Quebec was a place where fortunes could be made and social bounds broken, so it put the centralized Jesuit mind of Charlevoix ill at ease. Who has halted the progress of the gospel among these barbarians? And how is it that the oldest of our colonies, the one that ought naturally to have been more populous, is still the least powerful of all? That is what the end of this history will reveal to the eyes of those who will be willing to take the trouble to read it attentively. Charlevoix. James Wolfe was born on January 2, 1727, to a lieutenant colonel of the Foot Guards by the name of Edward Wolfe and his wife Henrietta Thompson. The new family lived in Westerham, located in the county of Kent, and were of minor gentry. Though Wolfe did not possess a lineage as lofty as Montcalm's, his family had served the British crown under the Duke of Marlborough, claiming a respectable martial character. His father moved the family to Greenwich when James was 11. In order to be better positioned to receive commissions doled out by Whitehall, he would not have to wait long. Within 2 years, war had broken out with Spain, and Wolfe was tapped to serve alongside his father in the 1740 expedition to the West Indies. The logistical preparation was dismal, and the fleet sat packed with sickening men for 2 months in port. A young Wolfe was overcome by seasickness and had to disembark. The disastrous outcome at Cartagena and his father's own threadbare survival would color both Wolfe's future strategic thinking and fated outlook on life. He would harden himself 2 years later on the field of battle against the French during the War of Austrian Succession, facing plummeting temperatures, snowdrifts, and the bloody confusion of battle. He finally tasted victory at Dettingen, but Wolfe would lose his own younger brother just a year later to consumption. The younger Edward Wolfe had signed up and fought alongside James straight out of school, but his loss would harden Wolfe's resolve. Fighting the French was one thing in Flanders, but suppressing the widening Jacobite rebellion back in Britain would now have to take precedent over Wolfe's mourning. By fall of 1745, he was in Newcastle on the Tyne and reunited with his Major General father, where he witnessed how the steady order of battle could turn a clear route into an ordered retreat at Falkirk, and was promoted to as an aide-de-camp for the General Staff under the command of the Duke of Cumberland. Wolfe witnessed the brutality inflicted upon his original command from across the battlefield. Author Stephen Brumwell recounts an episode that occurred after the battle, as the Duke of Cumberland is surveying the landscape with his staff. The Duke comes upon a wounded clansman who scoffs at his presence, so he orders Wolfe to execute the man on the spot. Wolfe refuses as a gentleman, and the Duke is forced to find a common soldier to finish him off. He continued to fight on the continent for another 2 years, participating in the titanic struggle of Lawfelt, leaving him a wounded 20-year-old captain by war's end. Being stationed in Glasgow and the surrounding countryside, Wolfe often found himself in command of troops putting down local riots, before eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. After chasing around the tattered bands of Jacobites, Wolfe was finally afforded time to take a sort of grand tour in 1752. Spending several months in Paris practicing his French and integrating himself amongst the British diplomatic corps, he was again summoned back to his unit to cleanse further troubles in the Highlands. He witnessed the start of war preparations after the mounting defeats in the Ohio River Valley, but still was kept within England to put down further civil disobedience. His time in the service would introduce him to key future figures in the American narrative like Amherst, Gage, and Braddock, but he was finally called to duty as the Duke of Cumberland was evacuating Hanover. Wolfe sailed in September 1757 for the city of La Rochelle, but while successful in seizing some outlying fortifications, the expedition failed to land the force they carried. James Wolfe nevertheless was promoted to colonel and would soon enter our narrative in 1758 at Louisbourg. To recap our podcast narrative after many bonus episodes, the previous year of 1758 had seen a defeat of the British attempt to march north toward Montreal via Lake Champlain. Thrown back by Montcalm at the Battle of Carillon, British troops would regroup under Amherst to seize the fort the following year in 1759. While the battle raged to open the back door to Quebec, 1758 had seen the front door at Louisbourg thrown open, due in large parts to the heroic landings of James Wolfe. As his old army buddy Amherst advanced up the water route from New York, Wolfe would lead a dangerous invasion down the St. Lawrence, hoping to seize the mighty fortress city that marked the narrowing of the river. When Amherst met with Wolfe in December of 1758, he described the expedition of 12,000 men Wolfe would lead 2,000 miles across the Atlantic. Everything must be assembled at Louisbourg by the following May to coordinate with Amherst's own assault north. Almost 20,000 tons of shipping was escorted by 14 ships of the line and 6 frigates. These would join an additional 10 ships of the line and 4 frigates in North American waters. Wolfe would not only be taking on his first independent command of a land force, but he'd also have to master the combined operations of a naval venture as well. The French were busy too, making preparations. Ice had prevented the Halifax-based fleet from completely closing off the St. Lawrence to French shipping. Enough supplies had made it through the ice to provide 80 days of rationing, along with 400 professional troops. This was all the French Royal Crown could offer, but Montcalm was given supreme command for the final showdown. He chose to concentrate forces at Quebec. Montcalm had over 2,000 professional French soldiers, 1,000 native warriors, and around 10,000 habitant militiamen. The massive set of fortifications on the cliff would be expanded by defensive lines through Beauport to the falls at Montmorency. The British flotilla had moved into the St. Lawrence by May, with the mapping of the channels conducted both beforehand and in the wake of the fleet by James Cook, whose impressive charts made from the soundings allowed the expedition to bypass previous hazards. Arriving at the Ile d'Orléans on June 27th, Wolfe was able to see that he could not simply land on the broad beach to the west of the Charles River. The steep embankments above were heavily fortified. Point Levis was occupied on the opposing bank of the St. Lawrence, and Wolfe landed his men on the other side of the Montmorency River in July. Artillery was hauled into place, and a vicious bombardment of the city commenced. While several small raids upriver had succeeded in passing Quebec's guns, no large force had yet pushed past this obstacle, though a cove 2 miles upriver from the city had been identified as a possible landing site. For now, powerful tides and unique winds produced by the basin's geography kept the British fleet at bay. At the end of July, a decision was made to assault the end of the lines that extended out from the city toward the falls. The French redoubts that guarded the passage across the mouth of the Montmorency would need to be taken. This would allow the British to ford the mouth and support the landings. On July 31st, British artillery support ships attempted to beach themselves and realized the shallow mudflats placed them hundreds of yards from their target. Wolfe quickly realized his forces across the Montmorency could not ford the mouth until the tide changed in several hours. The assaulting grenadiers would be at the mercy not of the French in the redoubt, but of the supporting lines of militia on the cliffs above. Postponing the attack until the tide allowed support, Wolfe had a nagging feeling the French knew he was coming. This assumption was correct, given deserters had brought news of the general orders that had been delayed due to water conditions. Montcalm was prepared. The redoubt was abandoned, and forces holding the trenches above poured down murderous fire as British troops attempted to ford water several feet deep. A sudden rainstorm removed all hope of scaling the elevation to seize the French trenches, and the tide made the supporting force to withdraw. The British suffered nearly 50 dead and several hundred wounded. Now the affair had truly turned into a stalemate that favored the French. The British spent the month of August hoping a detached force under General Murray could distract Montcalm's attention via raids upriver, but this was ultimately unsuccessful at bringing about any major engagement that Wolfe sought. After 3 weeks out in the field, Wolfe's subordinate did gather news of British victories at Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and Niagara. The Crown's forces had captured every single important water route except one. The French spent the month attempting to counter the British thrust upriver by flying columns and sending wave after wave of fireships toward the British fleet in the basin. Wolfe fell ill at the end of August and was bedridden a bit, but recovered by the start of September. Though the French were suffering losses in the south, if they held Quebec until the winter, Nouvelle France would live on. As it happened, the leadership of the British naval flotilla told Wolfe they needed to pull the fleet out of the St. Lawrence, and quite soon he begged them for one final chance and offered up a forlorn hope. The scouting parties were convinced a lightly guarded cove by the name of Anse du Foulon could be a potential weak point. Having gained sufficient naval forces upriver from Quebec, Wolfe would need to withdraw his army encamped across the Montmorency River and deploy these men in reserve, should the surprise strike force be able to actually seize the ridge above the landing cove. Early on the morning of September 13th, the first wave used the ebb tide to carry them to the objective. The French sentries actually detected the landing flotilla's presence, but assumed they were a supply convoy due soon to arrive. French-speaking former Jacobites helped ease the way up the almost 200-foot-high cliff by distracting guards as the initial force reached the summit. By daylight, the British were well on their way to the walls of Quebec. The French found their strong position at Montmorency Falls outflanked. The Marquis de Montcalm decided upon a brash maneuver. He would confront the British before they could set up a siege of the fortress city. In an engagement that lasted less than an hour, both Wolfe and Montcalm were mortally wounded, while the fate of North America was sealed. Routing the French force hemmed in by the restricted battle space and decimated by clever use of the undulating terrain by their enemies, the British gained control of Quebec and hunkered down to await resupply by sea. Ironically, this British force would be defeated in the Battle of Sainte-Foy the following April, as detailed in the opening of this episode, but the French were unable to reconquer Quebec before the British relieved it by water. I attempted to scale the upper third of this terrain just south of the plains. This was in the daytime, and the sheer steepness, along with the incredible amount of hardwood vegetation, makes the British nighttime ascent in full gear, nothing short of a miraculous operation. If you've ever stood on the Plains of Abraham and looked north toward Quebec, you can instantly see how the rolling terrain comes to a crescendo. Before dipping slightly toward the city walls, it was here in this small dip that the French met their match. The change in elevation is slight, but enough to give the well-placed British lines the advantage and surprise they needed. Folks always ask, did Montcalm have to gamble everything that morning on the Plains of Abraham? And I say no. Remember, Montreal is not lost yet, and Levis had evacuated the northern lake forts with several thousand men positioned around Montreal. The Marquis also had forces to the north in the defenses around Montmorency. Had he decided to man the walls, these forces could have converged on Wolfe's troops. Wolfe's moves were actually the last roll of the dice before his expedition met failure. Instead, Montcalm panicked a bit, but thought he could deliver a crushing blow to the expedition in a single battle. Wolfe's gamble created a series of cascading effects that shook Montcalm emotionally, and in turn led him to roll his own set of dice in the process. Wolfe's gambit threw Montcalm off his game and played to his sense of Homeric destiny. Historian Christian Crouch writes, Montcalm, his officers, and even some of the Marines received an education that valued the contributions of the classical world. For arriving French nobles in 1755 and 1756, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid provided a lens through which to view and understand their new assignments overseas. Like Achilles and his crack myrmidons in Homer's Iliad, Montcalm and his thousands of French troops, competent and prideful, guarantors of future victory, found themselves caught up in a destructive quarrel no one had foreseen. A quarrel not over the rules governing the spoils of war, but over the rules of war itself. This inner conflict between canny warriors would ultimately undo the unified effort required of France to maintain its North American empire. Underneath the politeness expressed on all sides in the spring of 1756, opinions about others swiftly formed. A culture war had begun in earnest. So what happened to the leaders of New France's royal government and military command after the fall of Quebec? 50 major leading figures of New France's elite were indicted on charges of fraud in the L'Affaire du Canada. Former Governor-General Vaudreuil and the last Royal Intendant Bigot topped the list of mostly former prominent colonial marine commanders who were accused of using their extended native and Canadian-born family kin groups in the fashion of a unified cartel. French royal prosecutors attempted to use the Native Alliance system of copious gift-giving as a backdoor for corruption insinuations. Many were accused of using wide personal liberty when executing official diplomatic missions. Trials went on from 1760 to 1763, and many spent anywhere from several months to 3 years in the Bastille. Only the intendant Bigot was found guilty and forced to pay a very large fine. Most former troupes de la marine were let off with judicious circumspect in the form of warnings. Thanks for listening to Season 1 of New York, Quebec, and the water route to the center of the world. Make sure T0 check back for the release of Season 2 on the American Revolution.